Before our show today, we have a quick announcement. We are just launching our new cohort for our Next Economy MBA. What's that? Why should someone take this course? What's the benefit? This 9-month course provides a holistic framework to develop your understanding and literacy in practical elements of engaging in the next economy that you won't find anywhere else. There are limited seats available. Take advantage of our early bird discount and sign up to claim your seat. To learn more, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA and sign up today. Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm your host, Andrew Baskin. The goal of this interview series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, diverse, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good. In this episode of Next Economy Now, Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy, interviews Chris Crass. Chris is one of the leading voices in the country calling for and supporting white people to work for racial justice. He's a social justice educator who writes and speaks widely on courage for racial justice, feminism for men, lessons from past movements, and creating healthy culture and leadership for progressive activism. He works with community groups, schools, and faith communities to develop leadership and momentum for social justice action. He's the author of Towards Collective Liberation, Anti-Racist Organizing, Feminist Praxis, and Movement Building Strategy, and Towards the Other America, Anti-Racist Resources for White People Taking Action for Black Lives Matter. So without further ado, please enjoy Ryan Honeyman's conversation with Chris Crass.
Chris, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Cool. Well, let's start with your background. How did you first get interested in the racial justice work you're doing today?
Yeah, so for me, I grew up in Southern California, in Los Angeles, Orange County area, and I got involved in social justice activism as a high school student when I was 15, and just really feeling a lot of the alienation and just feeling like there was something wrong in society in terms of war economy. In terms of just structural inequality, I saw a lot of poverty, racial segregation, and just felt like something was wrong. And so when I first met some activists who started talking about, well, part of what's wrong is the economic system that we live in is based on generating enormous wealth and profit for the few at the expense of the majority. That really resonated for me, and I felt a lot of class anger. Growing up in a mostly extended, a white working class family, seeing a lot of the ways that, schools and parks and public institutions were, underfunded, and just feeling a lot of that kind of class anger. But then over the years, as I, got involved in anti-war activism, with the first Gulf War in '91, for me, anti-racism was about being against the Ku Klux Klan and against neo-Nazis, which is a good thing. Which is, we crucially need as many white people as possible to be against the Klan and against neo-Nazis. But really having a deeper understanding of systemic white supremacy and the enduring reality of racism was the Rodney King verdict in Los Angeles. So African-American motorists pulled over for speeding at night, brutally beaten by 4 white police officers who were 30 miles from my house, were acquitted in an all-white jury in Simi Valley. In the other direction from my house growing up, Los Angeles went up in flames as tens of thousands of people took to the streets in protest of police brutality. And the enduring reality of racism was the world could see. And so I've been raised with kind of a colorblind, sort of like, there's racist white people who talk about race, which there was a lot of people in my family who were racist and talked about race all the time. But the kind of idea for if you want to be a good white person is to sort of like not see color, don't really talk about racism, just kind of have these sort of general statements of everyone is equal, but then don't really talk more about it. And so when the Rodney King verdict happened, my whole understanding of sort of like, being in a post-racial, civil rights movement ended racism, that worldview went up in flames, just like Los Angeles was going up in flames. And so out of that came a recognition of the nightmare of racism as this enduring reality in communities of color, But then more and more, as I started learning about racism, was learning about the ways that white people are consciously or unconsciously complicit in maintaining racist power structures within society, and that white privilege and internalized white superiority and these different ways that white supremacy operates to bring white people, particularly white working class and middle class people, in to be either, again, consciously racist or unconsciously good, liberal, progressive white people who want to do the right thing, but have no understanding of how white supremacy operates in society, because we're not supposed to. White people aren't supposed to understand this, aren't supposed to see it, are supposed to react in horror when people of color talk about racism and be in denial, be defensive. And so, as I got more involved in anti-racist work, the more I started realizing how much white supremacy negatively impacts white people and turns white people into soldiers against people of color. And I did not want to be a soldier against people of color. I did not want to see white supremacy continue to fan the flames of resentment and hate in families like mine against people of color, and to actually be able to galvanize the anger that existed in my family about economic inequality, but turn it into a commitment to justice, economic justice, racial justice, social justice, instead of a racist hatred towards people of color.
And for people who on the podcast, you can't actually see you are a white male. And so how did that talk about your, after Rodney King and you were starting to learn more about it, what was your experience as a white male? And how did you sort of evolve your role in the movement? Like, how did that sort of evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that started happening is I got involved in multiracial alliances for immigrant rights, against police brutality, and there would usually be as majority people of color coalitions on campus where I was starting to get active in community college or in community alliances. And oftentimes I would think, okay, well, when it comes to talking of issues around racial justice, my role is just to really support and kind of do logistical support or help out here and there to support the people of color led effort. But really, my role is kind of more like just show up and, do what I can when there's a call for volunteers to do different things. But kind of this just shut up and learn, which is an important thing for a white man to start to think about is, okay, how do I, just realizing how much I didn't know about the history of people of color, the history of people of color social justice organizing, different ways of thinking about leadership and coalition building that came out of people of color led organizing. And so there was a lot for me to learn. But pretty quickly in doing this work, one of the things that happened was people of color starting to say, you know what, we need more and more white people to speak out and bring leadership in white communities around racial justice, because the majority of white people are told that people of color are your enemy, that racial justice means taking away your freedoms, your rights as a white person, that when people of color say they want equality or civil rights or dignity, that comes at the expense of white people. And so that white supremacy is leading white people to understand the world, and that there needs to be an anti-racist worldview, an anti-racist vision, anti-racist commitment that is being brought into white communities to help white people understand, why is racial justice important to me as a white person? Why is anti-racism crucial to my humanity? And not just ethically and morally, which is crucial, but also anti-racism is crucial to living in a healthy, vibrant, just society for everyone. And so more and more people of color said, we need more white people who are speaking to other white people, who are bringing leadership in white communities to align with racial justice, to align with multiracial efforts for democracy and for justice. Because if we only have, 10, 20 white people who are really committed to anti-racism and then just show up for the multiracial work and are supporting the people of color-led organizing, which is crucial, which is an important part of it. But if we don't also have white people who are trying to organize tens of thousands, millions of white people to embrace racial justice, to see the ways that racism is a poison, a toxic, a cancer, that white people in the majority are going to continue to be aligned with white supremacy, continue to be aligned with racism, and continue to be against progressive racial justice efforts. And so out of that, I started realizing that there's a lot of different ways for white men and white people in general to show up for racial justice work. Yes, sometimes it's about being in solidarity and supporting people of color-led organizing, whether it's around immigrant rights or Black Lives Matter, or indigenous struggles for sovereignty. But it's also crucially important that white people make their anti-racist worldview and understanding and values known in white communities, and to bring leadership within majority white community gatherings, families, institutions, businesses. And so the more and more there's white people who are saying, you know what? Yeah, what's happening with police killings of Black people is wrong. Or, you know what? I support the NFL players who are taking a knee during the national anthem. This is why I think that what they are doing is so important and why I am with them. Or, just a whole variety of ways of speaking out for racial justice, but also trying to figure out what are ways to really truly resonate with the hearts and minds of other white people. Because white supremacy is telling white people every single day that racial justice is your enemy, that people of color are trying to either trick you or take something from you. Obama as president is trying to take all your hard-earned tax dollars and just give it out freely to people of color who aren't working hard, who are just taking advantage of you. Those stories are being told in white communities all the time. Or even for progressive liberal white people, the story is being told of, you need to go help people of color because people of color don't know how to help themselves. They're so deprived. They are so under-resourced that you need to go out and save them. And so these stories,
I think that's really,
and so that story of, for good liberal white people to go save people of color is another way that white supremacy creates this idea that white people, again, are superior, that white people are the ones that have all the answers, have all the best ideas. And so that white people just need to show up and bring their good ideas to people of color. And so what I started realizing, the more and more I was working in these multiracial coalitions, the more I was, taking, Black history classes, Chicano studies, Native American history classes, the more I started learning and just also just showing up and learning from different community groups that were organizing in communities of color, was how much vision, leadership, brilliance, historic lessons and insights for what needs to be done exist within communities of color for white people to actually be able to go listen and learn and expand our own sense of what democracy is, of what a healthy society is, because white supremacy creates a stranglehold on white people's minds, saying that there's only so much democracy, there's only so much liberation to go around, and so you better get yours, hold on to it, protect it, and don't let anyone come and try to take any of it from you. And so a racial justice, people of color centered democratic vision is one of democracy there being enough democracy for all of us. There being enough dignity for all of us that as you affirm someone else's dignity, your dignity grows as well. And so this sense of collective liberation, as bell hooks and women of color feminists have written about, the sense that our liberation is tied to each other. And so for good liberal white progressives, I understand the impulse to say, like, oh my gosh, I'm starting to realize that there's all this poverty and people of color, the schools and the public institutions so under-resourced and underfunded. I need to go help them. But the racial justice, anti-racist values ask for white people, what is it that I need to learn from people of color? So while people of color have experienced hundreds of years of oppression, people of color have also developed tremendous resilience and leadership and visions and strategies of resistance and an idea of what a different, positive, cooperative, healthy society can look like, that people of color movements and organizations and leaders have so much to bring to an understanding of what a different world can look like. And so for white progressive people to realize that white supremacy has malnourished us, white supremacy has denied access to these visions and these histories and these narratives from people of color, and that part of our role as white progressive people is to recognize how malnourished white supremacy has made us from the histories and lessons from people of color and people of color justice movements, and open our hearts and our minds and our ears to learn from that leadership, to learn about that history, and to realize it's not about white people going and saving people of color. It's about white people breaking down the ways that white supremacy has cut white people off from people of color and taught us that people of color are inferior to white people. That for white progressive people to recognize that as a crucial part of our work to break down these barriers that racism has built up within us and within our communities through segregation, intellectually, cultural, physical segregation, to break down those barriers and to work in solidarity and support the leadership within communities of color, everything from alternative business models within communities of color to justice movements in communities of color. I mean, you said you grew up in Fresno, the Central Valley area. So, I mean, everything from the United Farm Workers and the incredible organizing that has happened within working class organizing in communities of color. There's so much lessons for us. So rather than this idea of a white going and saving people of color, this idea of an anti-racist solidarity of white people rejecting the worldview of racism and embracing and learning more and more about a multiracial democratic vision, a multiracial racial justice worldview and history.
Yeah, it seems like there's a noxious, well, it's interesting because it feels like the Trump administration has actually spurred more white people to be anti-racist, because I feel like we have this combination as white people, maybe even more as white men, where it's you don't have to think about it. That's a privilege, right? You can sort of just live your life and it doesn't really, we think it doesn't affect us, right? But that's one problem. Two
Right.
is maybe we're interested and maybe we're intellectually supportive of it, but we don't know what to do about it. And then three, since we don't know what to do about it, or there's just a lot of things we could do, we just don't do anything. And I love that you told this story about we need more awkward white people. Can you tell that story about the difference between awkward white people and confident white people when talking about race?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I grew up in a family where there were really confident white people who talked about race. Because sometimes you hear this thing, particularly in progressive circles, of white people don't like to talk about race. It makes white people feel really uncomfortable. They're not sure what to say. They don't want to appear like they're racist. It's just really uncomfortable. But again, my experience growing up, with a lot of racist white men who spoke very confidently about race and looked for opportunities to talk about race. It's not just that they weren't afraid to talk about race. They were looking for ways to make everything about race from a racist perspective. The reason our schools are underfunded or overcrowded, it's not because of the massive tax cuts to the rich and the gutting of the tax base and the stealing of the tax money from working class communities to benefit corporations. It's all those undocumented immigrants. It's black women on welfare, on and on and on and on again. And so oftentimes, thankfully, my mom in my family, she would argue back and she would say, no, that's not right. That's not true. And that was incredibly helpful for me because, again, and I think this is true for a lot of white kids, the only people I heard in my family, in my community, speaking explicitly about race who looked like me were racist. And so that was, if you talked about race, it was a racist worldview that was waiting for you, that was being fed to you. But an anti-racist worldview, in my experience, was usually really, awkward and uncomfortable and didn't know what to say. So white people who wanted to do the right thing but didn't know what it was, or white people who knew racism is wrong but didn't have much else to go on. And so, didn't know how to have conversations about race, felt nervous, felt awkward, felt like they were going to say the wrong thing. And so that's why for me, it's like, I love awkward white people because, most white people, some white people did grow up with anti-racist role models. Some white people did grow up in really progressive, anti-racist households. But most white people do not grow up seeing other white people talking confidently about race unless they're racist. And so there aren't a lot of anti-racist role models that white young people are given. There are anti-racist role models out there, from Ann and Carl Braden to Howard Zinn, Zelphia Horton. There are so many incredible white anti-racist role models out there, but most white young people don't grow up knowing anything about them. And so for white people who want to start doing the right thing and want to be anti-racist, I remember, for years, going into these majority people of color, racial justice coalitions or meetings and just feeling super awkward, should I even be here? What am I supposed to do? And what is my place? And, should I talk to anybody? Would anybody want to talk to me? Should I say anything? Will people wonder what I'm doing here? Should I just say, hey, my name's Chris. I know that I'm a white man, so I shouldn't really take up much space, but I just want everyone to know that I'm really committed to anti-racism, and then I'm not going to say anything else again.
Did people push back on you for showing up? Like, what are you doing here? Like, did you actually get that at all?
I mean, there were times when, whether it was going into ethnic studies classes, where I'd be one of the few, white people in the class, or I would go to, majority people of color led rally. And so, and again, for me, I was always like, okay, I understand like the importance of having people of color only or Black only spaces, classes, rallies. But what I was looking for were the opportunities where it was, people of color led, but, white people could also participate. But sometimes folks who were also there to participate, they see a white guy who's, sitting in the class or at the rally and are kind of like, okay, well, what is this person doing here? Like, do they, sometimes even wondering, like, does he even know what he's here for? And I understand that because, a white man I was just at a rally recently, people of color led rally. And I was part of a team that was helping to keep the safety team, just kind of, helping to support the rally. A young white man showed up, and it was in a state where you can open carry. And so it was a young white man showed up, and he was wearing kind of a Confederate style hat and had a handgun on his, around his waist. And, so, a young white guy shows up, and immediately I'm like, okay, I want to make sure, is this person safe or is this person dangerous? Because, a white man cannot be assumed to be safe. Generally speaking, it's a reasonable thing to assume that a white man showing up in a people of color led space is dangerous, is there to be an adversary, is there to be disruptive, at the very least. So I understood why people would be questioning who I am. So, but over time it was like, at first it was sort of like, well, I'm just this individual. I'm just this why are you making all these assumptions about who I am? I'm just this individual person. But then it was realizing there's a history of white people. There's a history of white men in particular, of committing horrendous violence in communities of color, against women, against LGBTQ people. And so that it's not about everywhere I go, I have to prove myself in terms of then, going out to people and being like, hey, I just want you to know that I'm like a really good white guy. But when I show up into spaces, being able to understand that, okay, there's going to be distrust, there's going to be skepticism, there's going to be concern about who I am. And so how to just try to be in a space that is in a way that is supportive, that is showing that I'm there in agreement, that I'm there to learn or be in solidarity. And so just recognizing that I need to be mindful of how I show up and how I'm perceived by others. And to realize that being perceived negatively as a white man is a totally rational, completely understandable place for most people to be. And so being able to then, as a white man, have some humility around, no, I'm not just this individual, and I'm not just this, I've done so many great things, and, look at me. But being able to be like, you know what, I'm just another white guy showing up where distrust is understandable and makes a lot of sense. And so over time,
it's what communities of color have to deal with on
all
a
the time
basis. And so when you
all
walk away from the rally, you're still a white guy that everyone goes back to trusting on a default
exactly
basis. Yeah.
Exactly. And so being able to just recognize that relationships take time. Relationships, building community, building trust, building alliances, these things take time. But one of the things that I realized, and sometimes this can sometimes seem counterintuitive, the more I did work in white communities against racism and spoke and worked with and started bringing more and more white people into racial justice work, into solidarity around immigrant rights, into solidarity with Black Lives Matter, the more I was working with white people around racial justice, the more my relationships built with people of color and organizations of color to build those kinds of alliances. Because a lot of times for folks of color, they'd be like, okay, well, we don't want just more white people to show up and just sort of be waiting for people of color to say, you know what, you're not racist. We see you. You're a good white person. You're okay. You don't need to worry anymore about being racist. And I understand that. I mean, I would show up to things and be like, I hope I'm not racist. And I hope, I know I'm not supposed to want people of color to tell me I'm not racist, but it'd be really amazing if somebody did tell me, because I don't know if I'm racist or not, it's just awkward, and it's confusing. And so for me, it was like, okay, I'm not trying to get people of color to tell me, oh, you know what, you're a good person. My goal is more of how to really listen to what people of color are saying they want and need. And people of color for hundreds of years have been talking about the importance of white people organizing other white people for racial justice, of white people speaking out and taking action in white communities and mostly white institutions, businesses, schools for racial justice, for white people to be in solidarity and support people of color-led movements. And so instead of showing up and saying, to people of color, like, okay, well, what is it that I can do? More of, okay, how can I really take some time to listen to what people of color, leaders of color, justice organizations of color have been calling on white people to do for a really long time? And then I understand that for average, everyday white people who haven't thought about this, they're not going to have access to Barbara Smith, Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, hundreds of years of women of color, feminism, and leadership. So my job is not to then go and say, all you white people are so racist. My job is to, okay, what have I been learning from organizations and leaders of color? And how can I help bring more of that history, those insights, that leadership, and bring that more into white communities? And how to help white communities get nourishment from liberation leadership of color, justice organizing from communities, that history, those lessons, how to help nourish white communities in racial justice, rather than just going and just telling all the white people I know how racist they are. I want to help, because white supremacy has trained every white person in this country to be deeply committed to white supremacy, whether they are progressive, whether they are Republican, wherever they at politically. White people have been trained and supported to be racist to the core, either as good white people saving people of color who are ignorant and don't know how to save themselves, or as racist white people who are committed to maintaining structural inequality through racism. So for anti-racist white people, the goal is not to just go out and tell white people how racist they are. The goal is to help support more and more white people to have a hunger, to have a deep thirst for racial justice, for multiracial democracy, and for more and more white people to see ending racism as part of all of us getting free, as all of us creating economic justice, as all of us creating healthy communities for our kids, for our elders. So creating that hunger, or helping white people recognize that they are hungry, that they've been malnourished. And not the hunger is not because people of color have taken the resources. The hunger is not because of, this misplaced resentment towards people of color. The hunger is there because structural inequality justified through racism has been starving white communities of liberation values, liberation history, even white anti-racist history has been taken from white communities. And so for more and more white people to have access and entry points to racial justice. So that's my job and the job of other white anti-racists who want to do work against white supremacy, is to learn, listen, be in solidarity with people of color-led justice organizations, but then to also help bring leadership, help bring a different understanding of the world, a multiracial democratic worldview into white communities from a place of how to help save white people. So my job is not to save people of color. My job is to help save white people from this death culture of white supremacy that has trained white people to be soldiers against people of color.
What are your thoughts on I've heard white people say, well, it's not about race, it's about class. That's like a classic, I feel like, argument. And it's not to say that we shouldn't look at class, but can you talk about that argument? And, I don't know if you also saw the Raj Chetty study about, race has dramatic effects on, basically African-American men who start off wealthy have a 4 times more likelihood of losing that wealth in their sort of generation as opposed to white men with like sort of all the other areas controlled for. And can you just talk about like this race versus class argument?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way the United States has organized class is through white supremacy. And so capitalism in the United States developed through enslaved labor of African people and stolen land from indigenous people. That's the basis for the economic system in this country. The enormous wealth generated through enslavement and the massive capital stolen, colonized from indigenous people. And so that creates the basis for a racialized, racist economic inequality. So when people say, no, it's not race, it's class, it completely makes sense around this race-class confusion, particularly in white communities, because, well, for one, white people are supposed to be confused. White people are supposed to be deeply confused about how structural inequality actually operates in this country. And so when people of color start talking about racism, instead of white people having their hearts and minds opened in a way to, those are some deep insights into how we can create a democratic and healthy society, white people are supposed to hear people of color talking about racism as an attack on them. And so white people are raised to be deeply confused about race, but also deeply confused about class. So I mean, in the United States, currently, more people are told that almost everyone's middle class, and the way that class operates is mystified. It's like this idea of rich people have just worked so hard, and everyone else just needs to try to emulate them. I mean, that whole cultural norm around class. And so when I talk with people about race and class, or it's really trying to go back to the ways that a lot of people of color, economic justice leaders, and economists have really looked at the ways that white supremacy through enslaved labor, through colonized land, created the basis for capitalism, and that the history of understanding race has really been about dividing indentured European servants from enslaved Africans and indigenous people. And so the first time you have the mention of white in U.S. law, colonial law developing in the United States, was in relationship to separating indentured European servants from enslaved Africans. And so the first time you have, because before that it was like people were English, they were Dutch, they were Christian, they were, they weren't referred to by the basis of skin color. So the first time you start having people referred to as white is in relationship to poor and working class white people being given certain political or economic rights, whether it's the right to own land, the right to carry a gun, the right to eventually, vote, was, and that was all for white working class and poor men. And then white women having second class status through their relationships to white men. But nonetheless, the development of talking about white people was in relationship to working class white people having access to certain political, economic rights at the same time that enslaved African people and indigenous people were having all any kind of not democratic rights, because they were already excluded from democratic rights, but having their humanity further and further stripped away. And so the black codes of, if you were born the mother of a slave, you were born a slave, of further legal and socially sanctioned torture and violence to increase productivity on plantations, a whole wide range of stripping away humanity. And so working class white people absolutely have had racism used as a way to exploit their labor, exploit their lives. So it's not about saying, white privilege means that white people have just had such a great life. It means that white people have been given certain access to rights or benefits, not being seen as a criminal when you walk into a store automatically, being able to have your authority, especially as a white man, your authority as a legitimate person, recognize, whether you're trying to get a home loan or you're, just talking to a police officer, those kinds of things that have been taken away from people of color for hundreds of years. So it's absolutely about class, and it's also absolutely about race, because the ways, again, that I, as a white middle class person, experience class is through race. So like you just said about how the accumulation of wealth has, the laws and social policies have supported white people being able to pass on wealth, accumulate wealth, whether that's, my family became middle class through low interest home loans through the GI Bill, which a lot of GIs of color were not given the same access to those low income home loans, or the boom of the suburbs after World War II that was through all these federal programs of low income home ownership programs and low interest business loans to build up, many of which were explicitly white only suburbs, white only neighborhoods, not just because that's, who was, culturally, but in the laws, actual redlining in the banks, but then also community agreements in the contracts of building up new suburbs, cities, counties, that these were going to be white only neighborhoods. And so my family became middle class through federal low income, low interest loan home ownership programs that then propelled us into the middle class over a couple of generations. That was denied over and over and over again to people of color. Not just denied like being able to buy a home, but again, for hundreds of years, your access to basic democratic rights have been denied. Your access to economic programs that the federal government has provided for white people for hundreds of years, whether it's the Homestead Act of free land for white people who will go out and colonize and take land from indigenous people and build up settlements throughout the West and colonize, Manifest Destiny, Homestead Act, free land. Those kinds of programs were at the expense of people of color. So when we talk about how wealth has been passed down, whether it's even just, being able to pass on your home, pass on, whether it was many jobs that were, you would be able to get better access to a job if someone in your family had previously worked there. Well, people of color who have been denied access to many of those jobs for hundreds of years. And so if there's this grandfathering in clause of you have access to this kind of a job because of previous family, employment, then again, that creates this structural inequality between white working class families that are still struggling, still trying to fight to be able to make ends meet within this economic system of capitalism. But it also, again, pits white families at this disadvantage against families and communities of color. So it's not about, is it race or is it class? It's how has race shaped class in the United States, and how has race been used to get white working class and white poor people to blame people of color for their problems instead of the bosses, the slave owners of indentured European servants, the corporations, the CEOs, the people who are making at the 1%, accumulating the wealth and the profit from all of our communities. So while you're ignoring the reality of a ruling class, because you don't know anything, you don't know about it. You're not taught about it. We're not raised to understand there's a ruling class, but we are raised as white people to hear about how people of color are trying to take everything from us, are trying to steal our jobs, are trying to take over our schools, overcrowd our hospitals, on and on and on. So that's what white people get raised in. So race is deeply shaped class in this country, and class is deeply organized through white supremacy. So it's not. So I understand the race class confusion, but it's about trying to help. Again, what's the history of this country? How has the economic system developed? And how can we create working class, cross-racial solidarity to create economic justice for all?
One of the things that I think I've noticed, it's like maybe even a white trait. I was speaking with Debbie Irving. I don't know if you know.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
Yeah. About, okay, so like a very white thing is like, what are the 5 action steps to address racism? It's almost like white people need like an action plan and a toolkit. But in acknowledging that, and when you speak, or when you have people who are like, maybe they're just starting out and they're intellectually aligned with this, but they've never done anything, or they don't know what to do. What are the steps you recommend somebody take in order to make progress towards that path of being a white anti-racist advocate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about how we understand the work. And so this idea of like it being a very, like a white people want to have the 3 things you can do. But again, if that's coming from a perspective of like, oh my gosh, racism is really horrible. Okay, what are 3 things that I can do so that I can now feel like I'm a really good white person and that I'm not racist, and now I can just like get on with my life? That's the danger. The danger is this idea, and I understand, because if you've been raised this whole time in your life to not understand racism, it's hard to be like, oh my gosh, this is all around us. This is like an enduring institutional reality that shapes the policy, the culture, the economic, political system we live in. So I understand the impulse to be like, okay, I just want to do 3 things and not worry about, and just be able to know that I'm not racist, because I don't want to be racist. And so for me, some of the steps is, this isn't about individual white people no longer being racist. I mean, yes, of course, we want as many white people as possible to no longer be racist. But for the people who are listening to this podcast, for the people who I'm talking with, the goal is not for you to be an individual, I'm not racist white person. The goal is for you to be a committed, racial justice, anti-racist white person who wants to end institutional structural white supremacy and get all of our communities of color, white communities, free from the nightmare, the cancer of racism. So, because the danger of individual white people who are not racist is then it becomes a thing of protecting your ego, protecting your persona as, well, I'm not racist. And so if your goal is just, I want to tell everyone and make sure everyone knows I'm not racist, that doesn't change the reality of white supremacy shortening the life the life of people of color by dozens of years compared to white people in the society. It doesn't change the wage discrepancies. It doesn't change the police brutality in communities of color. And so we don't need white people who are just not racist. We need white people who are on fire for justice and want to end racism. And so part of the steps then is how to deepen your capacity to be on fire for racial justice. So some of the initial steps that I encourage is for people to go out and start reading about people of color liberation movements, whether it's picking up books by women of color feminists like Bell Hooks, or Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, or reading about the history of social justice work in communities of color, both the civil rights movement, which is absolutely essential, the Black freedom movement in the South in the 50s and 60s, but also about the long history for hundreds of years of social justice organizing in communities of color. So being able to start reading about that history, being able to whether you're in a place where there's events where you can learn more about that history, or discussion groups, looking for resources to learn more about the history and organizing in communities of color for social justice, and looking for where is there racial justice work happening where you live that's being led by people of color, and how to start showing up in ways that is about solidarity. So whether that's about folks fighting for immigrant rights, whether that's folks fighting around Black Lives Matter and ending police brutality, whether that is a whole wide range of racial justice work that's happening in communities all over the country, from suburbs and big cities and small towns. How to show up, again, not as, oh, I'm going to show up and tell those people of color how they should really do this, and that to be effective. Or I'm going to go and I want to make sure everyone there knows that I'm not racist. But to go to those kinds of events, community gatherings, and again, trying to get a sense of like, is this a public event that's being called for? I mean, if you find out about it, then it's probably a public event. And being able to show up, to listen, to learn, to figure out, okay, how can my business, how can my organization support what's happening? And so businesses being able to support racial justice efforts, whether that's like, this night, this month, this business, whether it's like a restaurant. I know, a lot of different restaurants where to support racial justice, they'll say, like this night, all the, 20% of the proceeds are going to be supporting Mahente, which is a cutting edge national immigrant rights organization that's fighting for sanctuary, that's fighting to create multiracial democracy. And so promoting the organization to the customers who come, being able to then donate money, but again, making that kind of a commitment. So that's just like one example of what some restaurants I know have done. Other businesses, again, making a commitment of, we want to do a fundraiser, we want to help support. But again, even just as businesses speaking out of, we support sanctuary, we support Black Lives Matter, we support, and finding out again how to listen and learn from those kinds of organizing efforts led by people of color, to what are they calling for? What are the demands that they have around policy change in the community at the federal level? How can we support that? How can we speak out and say, you know what, we agree, we're in solidarity with that. But also for white people to take that step of starting to awkwardly and uncomfortably talking with other white people about race and anti-racism. And again, even if that's just at a family dinner conversation where someone starts going on in some racist tirade, even if all you're able to do is say, you know what, I don't agree. I think that's wrong. You're even being able to say that the way that my mom did is going to show it's not just a change. You're not just necessarily trying to change the mind of the person who at the dinner table is going on with this racist tirade. It's that if no one else says anything different, then it gives the impression that everyone agrees. And so for that 6-year-old cousin, the 10-year-old, son or daughter who's at that table and hears that racist tirade and no one challenging it, then they grow up thinking this is just what white people think. This is just normal. This is just, this is common sense. So to awkwardly and uncomfortably start being able to say no when you hear racism, but also proactively bring up racial justice. Talking about, whether that's a family conversation and just being able to talk about, something in your life. And again, not in some way that you're trying to guilt and shame other people in your family, but in a way of you're being able to speak authentically about something that's important to you. I went to this event that was just like, it was just so powerful. And it was just, I met some folks in the community who I didn't know before. And I learned about, just being able to authentically share important things in your life that bring in a racial justice worldview and values into white spaces is crucial. And I know it's super awkward, but it's important for awkward white people to get awkward and be able to develop our courage and our capacity to speak anti-racism fluently and poetically and powerfully, so that the confident, powerful voices speaking in white communities aren't just the racists. Because we literally need to save the lives, the hearts, and the minds of white people all over this country who are being told right now that the only white people who are for white people is the alt-right, Donald Trump, the Ku Klux Klan. Those are the only white people who have the best interests of other white people in mind. White anti-racists need to say, you know what, the best interest for white people, for our humanity, for economic justice, for a healthy society, is to do everything we can to end the nightmare of racism and build vibrant, multiracial democracy that affirms resources and respects the dignity of all. That's the world I want to live in. That's the world I want my kids to grow up in. And that's in the best interest of white people. The alt-right and Donald Trump do not love white people. They're continuing to lead white people into this death culture that continues to maintain economic inequality for the majority of white people who are working class and poor and are struggling. And it says, don't do anything, don't organize a union, don't join in people of color struggles, don't rally around a progressive multiracial agenda. It says, white supremacy, hang on to it like an anchor that is going to drown you. But instead, the anchor that's going to drown you is being portrayed as a lifeboat that's going to save you. And so anti-racists need to speak powerfully and regularly in white communities about how anti-racism and racial justice is about all of us getting free in a real way that resonates with white people. White people need a vision of liberation connected to ending white supremacy, not a vision of maintaining a Make America Great Again that keeps white people in a stranglehold, in a prison of structural white supremacy that leads to hate, resentment, anger at people of color instead of a commitment to justice and joining with people of color.
Well, Chris, I could talk to you for another 4 hours. I feel like it's super inspiring, and for folks who are interested in learning more and maybe checking out your books or having you speak at their place, can you give folks a little background on what are the other things you work on and where folks can learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is chriscrass.org, and through the website, you can get links to the books that I've put out. Towards Collective Liberation is a book of essays, lessons around social justice organizing, around anti-racist work, stories around my own coming into consciousness around sexism as a white man, and coming into consciousness and beginning to get involved in anti-racist work. That book, Towards Collective Liberation, and then the other book that you mentioned, which is Towards the Other America, which is, in both the books, have a lot of interviews with white people who are doing incredible anti-racist work in their communities. So Towards the Other America interviews with, working class organizers in, Maine, in California, in the South, who are doing really incredible work to, exactly as we've been talking about, how to help more and more white people come into racial justice and anti-racist work, while also working in solidarity and meaningfully supporting people of color-led racial justice work. It's a both and. It's not an either or. It's a both and. So both of those books you can get through the website, but also I do talks and workshops with community groups, with businesses, with schools, with faith communities, and so would happily come in and do work with your community. It's an opportunity again to bring white people. They're not just for white people, but it's definitely a message geared towards supporting more and more white people to develop a passion and a fire for justice that is committed to ending racism. And so the website has information about that as well. But also just encouraging people to, it's an overwhelming thing thinking about, okay, how are we going to end white supremacy? How are we going to create a cooperative, just economic system? And again, just step by step, the more we move on this path, the more opportunities, the more inspiration, the more lessons we gain. And so Paulo Freire, an amazing Brazilian, social justice educator, he talked about, we make the road by walking. And so as long as we understand the steps, this is something you can do, this is something you can do, as being on a lifelong journey for liberation, then offering up action items and steps and toolkits is fantastic. So we're not trying to get a quick fix, because a quick fix is going to leave us stuck where we are. We want a long haul. We're in this journey to get free. And in the process of doing this work, we build beloved community. We build relationships. We build a new authentic connection to ourselves, to the earth, and to what does it mean to be human in these times. And we need that kind of grounding and connections and beloved community to be able to be resilient and powerful in these times.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Chris. And you heard it here for listeners. Get awkward, white people. That's a good. I love that, because it gives you permission to like move forward. So, thanks again for being on the show, and look forward to following your work in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for all that you're doing, and for everyone out there who's trying to create some new economic institutions for us to thrive.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. Lift is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. To listen to all our past episodes or to share your thoughts about the show with us, visit www.lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. It's really very helpful in allowing these ideas to reach a wider audience. Once again, thanks for listening.